This is TWiT.
All right, so I promised net neutrality is coming. Do you remember that? I remember net neutrality. It was the thing before Ajit Pai made his way to the head of the FCC. I suppose the transition away may have started a little bit before him, but it really intensified then. Ajit Pai and the FCC began actively seeking to kind of kill net neutrality regulation. Well, with the new Biden presidency comes the departure of Pai from his chairman role. Times are changing in many different ways right now, as we've all seen. And joining us to talk about the resurgence of net neutrality law is Karl Bode, who wrote for Vice about California's big net neutrality win. Welcome back.
Hey there. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's really great to see you. It's been a little while, so I'm happy we could get you on today. So, okay, so, so much has happened in so many facets of our lives in the last 4 years. Net neutrality was just one of those things. And I remember when all of this was dusting up, it was such a big deal. And then, we get consumed with everything else. Now we're back. And I suppose, it's a good thing that we can, get used to hearing the term net neutrality and, stories like this. So maybe recap a little bit what's happened in the past few years prior to some of these recent developments happening in California.
So, this is a battle that's been going on for, I think, more than a decade at this point. I think the FCC in 2010 passed their first net neutrality rules, which were really kind of flimsy. They didn't cover wireless at all. They had a lot of loopholes for broadband providers. And the broadband industry still sued to overturn them because their goal has always been really no federal or state oversight of their businesses at all. And they won that lawsuit. And then the FCC returned in 2015 and passed tougher rules that the industry then sued again to overturn and failed. And then Ajit Pai came to the FCC, at which point he decided he was going to dismantle the rules, despite the fact, they have the broad bipartisan support of the majority of Americans. And once they got rid of them, the states immediately rushed to fill that vacuum with their own rules, most of them, California being the biggest one. But interestingly enough, the FCC's repeal of net neutrality attempted to also ban states from being able to protect consumers. So they didn't want oversight on the federal level. They didn't want it on the state level. They basically wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They didn't want any oversight. And this week a court declared that California would be allowed to go forth and start enforcing their own rules. In part thanks to the fact that the Biden administration backed off of trying to back a lawsuit via the industry that would have scuttled the California rules. So it's been a very thorny, complicated mess. But this week, the California finally got the green light to start enforcing their own rules, which were slightly tougher than the ones the FCC created in 2015.
Okay, and then taking a look at this, I suppose what I was trying to figure out, but I think you kind of answered my question, which was whether this shift, this transition in California, because a lot of this pushback in California started well before our current Biden presidency. Could this have happened last year? Could this, or rather, could this have still happened if Trump had been reelected to another presidency? Would it have been likely that this would reach this moment in court, or things would be looking at a completely different scenario?
I think they still would have had problems because, the argument of the broadband industry is that states, the federal government can't regulate them, but states can't either. And the courts have repeatedly found that, if the FCC is going to go out and say, okay, we really don't care about consumer protection anymore, we're just not going to do it. Right. The FCC and others can't just go and say that states can't fill that void. It just the courts, haven't agreed with them, and that's their basic argument at this point. So I think it was important that the Biden FCC pulled the DOJ's support from the lawsuit. But I still think they would have run into problems because their legal argument here is basically they want no oversight of these massive monopolies. And I think the one thing that gets overlooked is that, net neutrality is itself a very thorny policy issue, but it really comes down to broadband competition or the lack of it. These broadband providers wouldn't engage in dodgy anti-competitive behavior if their customers could vote with their wallets and switch to another ISP. So net neutrality rules are kind of this stopgap attempt to hold them accountable for bad behavior in the absence of competition. But if you actually embrace policies that drove more competition to markets, this would have never been a problem. So that's, I think it comes down to monopolization, which is something that kind of gets overlooked in the policy discussions.
So, okay, so then we're here where things are kind of changing, at least in the state of California. We can talk about kind of how that broadens out in a second. But what exactly does this pave the way for? Like, what power does this then seem to give, at least in the state of California?
So California can now start enforcing their law, which was a little tougher than the FCC rules. So if like Comcast starts throttling a competitor's service because it competes with its own service, California can step in and, have the authority to hold them accountable for that. Now, I think the federal government is also going to eventually restore federal net neutrality rules. But that requires that they appoint a third FCC Democratic commissioner so that they have the voting ability to make it happen. And that's probably going to happen here in the next weeks to months.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that was another big question that I had is kind of, this is great for California. How does it broaden out? But it sounds like from what you're saying, the likelihood of the FCC kind of reversing course on a broad sense for throughout the U.S. is pretty high, depending on some near-term changes. What are those changes exactly?
Well, to vote to restore net neutrality, the FCC is broken down on a partisan basis. So whoever wins the White House has a 3-2 majority at the FCC. But right now they're gridlocked at 2-2 commissioners. So the Biden administration has to appoint that third commissioner, at which point they'll probably vote to restore the rules. Now, the problem here is you end up with this regulatory ping pong, as they call it, where the FCC votes to dismantle the rules. And ideally, you would want Congress to just pass decent, basic net neutrality rules that say monopolies can't abuse their gatekeeper power. The problem with that argument is that, Congress is pretty heavily awash in telecom campaign contributions. So the chance of a bill with any kind of consumer protection teeth getting through there is, kind of thin. So we'll see. But in the interim, once the FCC restores them, then we can get back to the real conversation about, okay, what's the real issue? And the real issue is that there's just not a lot of competition in broadband. I think 83 million Americans have the choice of just one ISP, which is usually Comcast, and that results in all kinds of problems. Net neutrality just being one of them, high prices, bad customer service, spotty coverage, slow speeds, privacy violations, net neutrality violations. So it's all tied into one conversation. And I think, when I see net neutrality talked about, I see a lot of people's eyes kind of glaze over. So I think it's important to make it clear to people that this is really about a lack of U.S. broadband competition. And if we solve that problem, we wouldn't have to engage in these policy debates at all, because the market would kind of help let customers move to a different ISP if they had any of those problems.
How do you feel about kind of these emerging disruptors? Like Starlink comes to mind, of this idea of beaming the internet from a satellite, and like a solid support system as the foundation of that. Do you think that's like, how much does that help in this discussion? Yeah,
it helps. Starlink is going to be great for the people that are stuck in rural markets, and currently either have no access or have terrible, expensive old satellite access. So I think Starlink's going to be great for those folks. The problem with Starlink is it really still doesn't, satellites have to operate under the laws of physics, and they just don't have enough capacity, even these new lower orbit ones, to really deliver any massive scale in semi-populated areas. So the problem you're going to run into with Starlink is it will be great for these rural outliers and for some people, but it's really not going to make a dent. 42 million people, I think, have no broadband whatsoever. Another 83 million live under a monopoly. So, and I think Starlink will hit a couple million over the next couple of years. So with that scale, it's just not going to do it. You run into the same problems where with wireless, 5G is heralded as this magic thing, but you need fiber run to towers to make 5G work. And the investment on that front has been kind of skimpy for some time. So these things will help, and they'll definitely help for people in rural markets, but they're not going to really fix the monopoly or duopoly problem that you see in a lot of these American markets.
That's fascinating, man. That number is so high of people without internet access. I'm not sure I would have ever guessed that it would be that much. Yeah. It's so easy to be inside of our bubbles and just kind of expect that everybody kind of has the same opportunity or at least access to one ISP, but to have none, that just blows me away in 2021.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
One of the problems is the FCC's broadband maps have not been that great. I think the official FCC tally for people without broadband is somewhere around 20 million, but independent researchers have found that's actually double that. So, that's what they're working on now, is trying to get our broadband mapping to actually determine what areas do or don't have broadband service. So that's step one. Once you do that, you can identify competitive shortcomings and try to push some policies that help.
Yeah, having clear data is obviously the very first place you should go. Then you can go from there. We already kind of know what the broadband industry has done, in the past, let's say the last 4 or 5, 6 years, when things have gotten really friendly for them, but also prior leading up to that. Knowing historically what they've done and knowing kind of where the tea leaves are pointing that we're headed right now when it comes to net neutrality regulation, what do you expect to see from them in response to all of this? I mean, I imagine a whole lot of litigation, but what do you think about that?
Well, they'll appeal the California case, and I'm sure when the FCC tries to restore it, they will complain and they will file more lawsuits. But their arguments are growing thinner by the moment when you have such a profound monopoly. I think they're fortunate right now because the conversation is so fixated on big tech. Big tech has a lot of problems. There are things that we need to work on, but it's kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room and allowed us to forget these other problems in the telecom sector. And I think they're going to find, with COVID creating a lot of new political pressure that I've never seen before on this subject, I think they're going to find it harder to use the arguments that they used in the past, that, this isn't a real problem, or this is just dated old regulation that's saddling our innovation capabilities, which is never, if you've talked to Comcast customer support at any point, innovation is really not high on the list of your experience. But, so I think they're going to trot out a lot of the same old arguments, and I don't think they're going to work as well in this new COVID reality, because the pandemic has really showcased how broadband is essential for survival and opportunity and employment and healthcare and everything. And I think people who didn't realize that before, which was already a shrinking segment, have kind of keyed in now. So I think the entire policy field in broadband has shifted pretty dramatically.